Sakshi TV's special immigration show with attorney Ms. Prashanthi Reddy from Law Offices of Prashanthi Reddy, PLLC. Ms. Prashanthi needs no introduction, but if you need consultation, please log on to reddyesq.com for contact information. When you connect with them, don't forget to mention Sakshi TV. From the beginning, reddyesq.com site has put a wealth of free information and online tools in the hands of the immigrant community and for the benefit of US employers. Today's topic is alternatives to H-1B, and we're talking about the O1 for STEM specifically. And so welcome to the show, Ms. Reddy.
Hi, Tony. How are you? Hope you're well.
Very well. Thank you. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
One more day, you're looking fabulous as ever.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, my dear. So let's start with the O1. Shall we start?
Right. Yes, Ms. Reddy. So would you please explain to our viewers about the O1 for STEM? I mean, what does it particularly mean? And we'll dive deeper.
Okay, sounds good. So as we know, the H-1B registration is done, and there won't be any more H-1s until next year. So in the interim period, we're always thinking as attorneys about how to bring, fulfill our clients' needs. If they need to come during the time, if they need to work during the time that H-1s are not available, especially if they're subject to the cap. So, and we often disregard or don't pay attention to some other work visas that are available. I do understand the reason why these work visas are in the fringe is because they're rather difficult to obtain, but you never know until you have at least some basic idea as to what, how to get it, or, you never know whether you qualify or not. So it's important to have some information about these alternative work visas to a H-1 and see if you qualify. If you're the beneficiary or if you're the employer, maybe one of your employer qualifies and you don't know it. So for that purpose, I decided to do the show today on the O1 for people of extraordinary ability in STEM. We all know what STEM is: science, technology, engineering, and math. The reason I wanted to talk about this is that there was recent policy guideline, recent meaning in January of this year, where they clarified how USCIS evaluates the evidence to determine the eligibility for O1A based on STEM, specifically on STEM, because some of their forms of evidence that so the O1, just to backtrack, O1 is not just for people from STEM, it's also for people in the arts, it's people in the sciences, it's for business, it's for athletics. So there are various fields where you can file an O1, but we're today talking specifically about the ability in STEM. And this is really overlaps with your H-1s nicely, because usually people who are filing H-1s, majority of them are taken up by people who are in the field of STEM. Information technology, engineering, math, etc. So it's a good segue. O1 STEM is a good segue and a good alternative to the H-1B users. So the policy
What's
update.
What's the policy about? Right. Yeah.
Right. So the policy update was basically just provided additional guidance as to what documentation can be provided in case, the documentation that's mentioned in the regulation or in the policy, O1 policy document it doesn't exactly fit, because this documentary evidence is for all different types of categories. So they've realized that there is some shortcoming in their in the policy that they presently have, and they're saying that, look, if that documentation doesn't fit, or if that criteria doesn't fit, there's other criteria which might be closely related, which will still fit, and based on which you can still get the O1. I guess when it was written, they didn't think of STEM as such, people who are working in STEM, and they only thought of researchers or maybe artists when they wrote about it. So I guess they wanted to correct that flaw that they saw. So the policy basically says that the policy adds a chart or an appendix where they give examples of evidence that may satisfy the O1 STEM criteria. And the policy also provides examples of comparable evidence that the petitioner could provide to support a STEM petition, a STEM O1 petition. The policy also clarifies how officers can evaluate the totality of the circumstances rather than saying if one or two things fit, to look at the overall picture and provides examples of positive factors that could affect the decision of the officer, even if they don't meet some criteria. So they're asking the officer to look at the overall picture and see if a particular person meets the O1 extraordinary ability qualification under STEM.
Right. So,
yeah. Also, last point, Tony, also explains that when evaluating whether a beneficiary of extraordinary ability is coming to work in a beneficiary's area of extraordinary ability, they wanted to see if they're not working in the same area, is it okay? Are they working in a substantively similar area? Because one of the criteria for an O1 is not only should they have all this eligibility, but they should come to the US and should continue to be working in their area of expertise. So say they're not working exactly in their area of expertise, but they work in a similar area. Is that okay? And under what circumstances is it okay?
Right. Right. So, since you've told us about the new updated policy of this, are there perhaps any other policy highlights that you'd want to mention along with the old ones? Anything you'd want to mention for the highlight?
I think I've mentioned everything under the new policy. We should go now into more detail.
Right. So, would you want to talk about the eligibility for this particular policy?
Right. So before, yes, I will talk about that in a minute. Let's first talk about the standard for general standards for classification of an O1, and this is very short, and then we'll go to eligibility. The general standards for classification of an O1 is extraordinary ability in that particular field. So in the field of science, education, business, or athletics, a level of expertise indicating that the person is one of a small percentage who have risen to the very top of their field of endeavor. So O1 is obviously not for everyone. It's for a person who has excelled and come to the top of their particular field. So we just have to remember that general standard of classification for an O1 when we talk about O1s in general, whether it be STEM O1s or otherwise. So now coming to your question with reference to the eligibility criteria.
Right.
The eligibility criteria is basically extraordinary ability in the sciences, education, business, or athletics. The achievement would have to have been recognized in the field through extensive documentation. So we have to show that that he or she is recognized in their field and be able to provide extensive documentation. And that person should have demonstrated sustained national or international acclaim. Number 2. Number 3 is the person is coming to the US to work in that particular field. That's number 3. So those are the general eligibility criteria, Tony.
Right. So since you've told us that the first criteria for the eligibility has to be the supporting documents, could you please explain what are the supporting documents to be provided here?
Yes, sure. So the supporting documents has to show evidence that the beneficiary has received major international recognition award. If you have that one thing, then you don't need anything else. But how many of us are Nobel Prize winners, right? So if you have a Nobel Prize, you don't really need anything else, or something that is similar or of the same, criteria. But if you don't, like most of us, then they document 9 points. Out of that, you have to at least meet 3. 9 documentary evidence that you can show, and you have to meet 3 out of that. So just to go through each one by one, documentation of the beneficiary's receipt of national or international recognition, prizes or awards of excellence in their field. Okay, so this is something lower than the Nobel Prize. If you
Right.
have received other prizes that are, say you were in India and you received something specific to your state. So say you were in Telangana state and you received an award from the Telangana government for your research. That could be definitely be one of the criteria. The second criteria is beneficiaries' membership in associations in the field for which they are being sought. So membership in a STEM discipline. So the membership in this particular organization, which is a STEM organization, the criteria for the membership should not be that anyone can join. It should require outstanding achievement of their members. And it should be only open for those who are recognized nationally or internationally as experts in their field. So if you're a member of such an organization and the criteria of that organization is that you have to meet these really high standards, then that could be one evidence that you are a person of extraordinary ability. Another criteria is published material in a professional or trade publication or in media. So if your work has been published in, say, a scientific journal or a trade journal if you're in business, or in some major media like in a newspaper or in a magazine, say in India, say it's India Today or Newsweek or something. I'm just giving you an example. So if there is an article published with reference to your work, that is also an indication that you are of extraordinary ability. So that's definitely one criteria. Remember, out of all these criteria, you have to meet at least 3. The more criteria you meet, the better. But simply because you meet the 3 criteria, again, it doesn't mean that you will get an O1, because remember, they'll look at the overall picture.
Right.
The next point is evidence of the beneficiary's participation in a panel as a judge.
Right.
So you could be an individual judge, or you could be in a panel of judges and you're judging the work of others in your field. So obviously, if you're a judge and if you've been chosen as a judge, only people who excel in their field will be chosen to judge other people's work.
That's there, but would there be perhaps a scale to, determine how big or small it is? I mean, there are large scale events, there are small scale events. You could be the panel of, either. So would there be a criteria?
That is a good point. A good point. So, for example, if it's a local, some panel that is made up by, say, the university that you're working, they have a local panel where you're the only really person that qualifies in that field in that particular university, then depending on how, again, large or small the university is, if it's a small college, then obviously you can use it, but since you'll have to show what kind of event it is or what kind of event you were judging, they will take that into consideration as well.
So I think significance kind of matters here.
Yeah, so it's an overall picture that they're looking at.
Right. Yeah.
So, and then the next one is evidence of the beneficiary's authorship in an article, a scholarly article in their field. So they have written articles in their field. Say if they're a software professional and they've developed some kind of a software or some kind of application, and they have written, not only have other people written about you, but you've written an article about that particular thing that you've developed, and that article was published in a major media or professional journal, etc. So that could be, again, a reason they would judge you as being of extraordinary ability. Another reason, evidence that the beneficiary was employed in a critical or essential capacity in an organization or establishment that has distinguished reputation. Not any organization. I'm sure you must be an asset to your employer, but your employer can be some XYZ company, right? XYZ Inc. But if you're working, for example, for the government of India or for a distinguished non-profit organization in India, and that is of distinguished repute, then that, if you're working and you have a leading position in that is an example of distinguished reputation or excellence, right?
Right.
Another last but not the least, evidence that the beneficiary has attained either a high salary or will get a high salary or remuneration. And they can look at employment contracts to see that. But again, just this one criteria, just because you're getting a high salary compared to your other employees by itself will not be sufficient to meet that requirement. It will have to be more than that. So it's a total, that's why they said that just simply because you meet the 3 criteria doesn't mean you'll get an O1, but it's an overall picture that you have to paint to show that you are in the top 5%, say, or top 10% of your field, right?
Right.
So
Right.
just some of the examples that we can go through to better understand what kind of documentation is needed. So for national or international prizes, awards from well-known national institutions as well as well-known professional associations. Certain, like a PhD dissertation, if you've done a PhD and you've done a dissertation and you received a scholarship, that could be depending on what was the criteria for that scholarship and what percentage of people get into that scholarship or were given that award or dissertation award. Certain awards recognizing presentations as national or international at conferences. So you've presented something in a conference that could be considered to be an award, depending on what was the criteria for inviting you for that to present there. So they look at the criteria used to grant the awards or prizes. They look at the national or international significance of that award or prize, and they look at the number of awardees or recipients of that prize, and they look at the eligibility. What is the limitation on eligibility? Even to be eligible to get the prize, to even to apply to get the prize, what is the eligibility? So these are some of the things that they will look at for national or international awards. Now the other thing is the membership in associations. They look at, it's not just membership in any association, but they look at, an example would be a membership in a professional association or a fellowship. But it's not just any fellowship or any membership, right? So maybe as an example could be if you say are invited to be a member of IEEE, which is Electronics Institution of Electronics and Engineers. It's quite a well-known organization. So if you're a fellow there, so there are all different kinds of memberships for this one organization. So if you've been nominated as a fellow, then because the standard is so high, it's possible that it could be considered to be, extraordinary ability. Also, there's another association for advancement of artificial intelligence, since we're talking about IT and STEM. So if you are a member of this organization, then again, as a fellow, then since the criteria is so high for this, it's possible that you could use this possibly as to show extraordinary ability. So if the membership criteria is simply a certain level of education or a payment of a fee or a subscription, then obviously that's not going to cut it, right? So it should be something more than that. Again, published material, major publications. We don't have the time to go through everything, so I'm just going to do it quickly. Any major online publications, not all print publications obviously, will be a criteria. And then evidence, they participated in a panel for that. There again, it has to be at the highest level. It can't be everyone. So, those are some of the examples that they give for, this evidence. So they've given a lot of examples actually for what kind of documentation, what will be acceptable, what will not be acceptable as documents, and if it is acceptable, what kind of, to what level do you have to meet the criteria for it to be acceptable, right? Like I gave you the few examples. Not membership in any organization, but membership in a particular organization. So those are some of the examples, Thorny, that
Right.
of evidence that one can produce to qualify for an O1.
Right, but are there any further factors that can probably determine the, eligibility criteria for the O1 classification?
Sure. So there are. So as I keep saying that it's a total determination, which means that um, the providing the required evidence does not in itself establish that the beneficiary meets the classifications, right? As a person of extraordinary ability. So the evidentiary requirements specified all the above ones, even if they have it, the officer has to then proceed to evaluate the totality of all the evidence in the record to determine whether it establishes that the beneficiary has sustained national or international acclaim in their field and that they have risen to the top of their field. So it's the total, they keep saying that it's the total picture that you're giving. It's not just any one point or one
Right.
document that you submit. Also, if we're not able to submit the exact evidence that they have listed, there is comparable evidence as well. Because in certain fields, certain evidence may not be applicable. So if the petitioner can establish that a particular criteria is not readily applicable to that beneficiary's occupation, then the beneficiary may submit evidence that is not specifically listed in that criteria, but it is comparable, right?
Right.
So it does not have to be exactly the same, but it has to be comparable. The only time when comparable evidence is acceptable is when the evidence that they've asked for is not really applicable to your profession. So comparative evidence is allowed if the petitioner shows that a criteria is not easily acceptable to the beneficiary's job or profession. So there might be, for example, if you say research, maybe what you're doing is in industry. You're working in an industry, you're not doing research. So the criteria on publications, that may not be applicable, that you've published in an academic journal, but you might have written an article about your app, say in an industry journal, like in Business Week or, in a commercial space. So, that will be acceptable. It doesn't have to be an academic journal. So that's just one example. So again, they say that officers may consider any potential relevant evidence, even if such evidence does not fit one of the regulatory criteria or was not presented as comparable evidence. So even if previously you did not mention something as comparable evidence, even if it's not comparable, but it's something completely different and it's not mentioned in the criteria, you could still use that as evidence to show that you excel. Because obviously when they wrote the law, they couldn't think of everything. So they're giving you that leeway to be able to apply even if you don't strictly meet their exact, evidentiary requirements.
Right. Right. So, Ms. Reddy, is there anything that applies to, beneficiaries coming to the United States to continue work in the area of extraordinary ability?
Right. So basically,
O1, yeah.
Right. So one of the criteria for the O1 for arts or STEM or movies or whatever the area might be in is that they should be coming to the US, or if they're already in the US, they should continue to work in their area of extraordinary ability. So that's one of the criteria. But again, there is some leeway here. There is some way for us to, even if they're not working in that exact field, in that exact area, USCIS is still willing to look at those applications and make a determination as long as, certain standards are met, right? So when considering a petition for a beneficiary who is transitioning, say, to a new occupation, for example, you might be a professor or an academic researcher, and you've received all your acclaim based on that. So you're working in the field of robotics as a professor, and you've researched, some new element of robotics, and you've written papers on it, etc., etc. It's not necessary that you should be coming to the US to work as a professor. It could be that you have been hired by a private company, a robotics company, so that you can use your expertise then in industry. So is that will be considered to be continuing in your area of expertise. So there's no statutory or regulatory definition to define the field or area of expertise or area of extraordinary ability. So again, they look at the totality of the circumstances. So you see a lot of this is subjective, because the officer does have a lot of say in ability to make decisions based on the totality of circumstances, because everything is not written down, and they don't have to follow the exact criteria that's written down.
Right.
There's a lot of areas for them to make their own determination. So generally though, area of extraordinary ability, the officer has to focus on whether the prospective work or services involves the same skill sets. Maybe it's not in the same field, but same skill sets, same knowledge. How are you taking forward that expertise that you have to work in the other industry that you're working in?
Right.
So whether the past or prospective occupation are in the same industry or otherwise related based on shared duties or expertise. That's one way of determining that. Whether the prospective occupation is supervisory, manager, same thing, but you're in a supervisory role. That would still be considered to be a similar position, because you're still using that, knowledge or the skill sets or your expertise.
Right.
Or it could be, if it is common for persons in one occupation to transition to another occupation. If it's common practice to do that in your particular occupation, then also that could be, officer can decide that it is in your area or field of extraordinary ability.
Right. So, Ms. Reddy, once again, with that we come to the end of the show. But what I'd like to mention before we end the show is how you come up with a new topic every single show, and you give our viewers so much information and explain to them the immigration law and policies and how it can be tailor-made for their particular situation. And we're very grateful for that and for having you on the show. And thank you so much, Ms. Reddy. It's a pleasure hosting you.
It's a pleasure for me as well. Thank you so much.
You're watching Sakshi TV Live. This is Torani. Thank you.